The forgotten hero of 9/11, Rescorla, saved thousands, not a household name. What if I told you that one man's paranoia saved more lives on September 11th than any government agency, first responder unit, or emergency protocol? What if that same man predicted the attacks, prepared for them obsessively, and then sacrificed his own life to execute the most successful civilian evacuation in American history? And what if I told you that you've probably never heard his name? In the pantheon of 9/11 heroes, we remember the firefighters climbing those doomed stairs, the police officers rushing toward danger, and the passengers of Flight 93 who fought back. But history has a cruel way of forgetting its most effective heroes, especially when their greatest triumph was making sure people weren't there when disaster struck. The man who saved nearly 3,000 lives that day wasn't wearing a badge or uniform. He was a 62-year-old corporate security chief with a British accent, a soldier's instincts, and an obsession that his colleagues once dismissed as elaborate paranoia. His name was Rescorla, and this is the story of how a Cornish boy who became an American warrior turned his final battle into salvation for thousands. Cyril Richard Rescorla was born in 1939 in Hale, Cornwall, to a working-class family that had weathered the Great Depression and the London Blitz. The boy who would grow up to orchestrate the largest successful civilian evacuation in American history first learned about courage from his grandmother's stories of surviving German bombing raids. But it was his own restless spirit that would forge him into something extraordinary. At 17, young Rick lied about his age to join the British Army, desperate to escape the confines of small-town Cornwall. He served with distinction in Cyprus and Rhodesia, but it was his transfer to the American forces during the Vietnam War that would define him. As a platoon leader with the 1st Cavalry Division's 7th Cavalry Regiment, Custer's old unit, Rescorla distinguished himself in some of the war's most brutal engagements. His most famous moment came during the Battle of Ia Drang in 1965, immortalized later in the book and film We Were Soldiers. As his unit faced overwhelming North Vietnamese forces, Rescorla moved through withering enemy fire, coordinating evacuations and inspiring his men with an incongruous sight that would become his trademark: singing Cornish folk songs at the top of his lungs while bullets whined overhead. His voice, carrying ancient melodies across a modern battlefield, became a beacon of calm in the chaos of war. But Vietnam taught Rescorla more than just courage under fire. It taught him to think like an enemy, to spot vulnerabilities before they became catastrophes, and to prepare for the worst-case scenarios that others preferred to ignore. These lessons would prove prophetic 3 decades later. After Vietnam, Rescorla earned a law degree and eventually found his way to Wall Street, where Dean Witter Reynolds hired him as Vice President of Security in 1985. When Dean Witter merged with Morgan Stanley in 1997, Rescorla became responsible for the safety of nearly 3,000 employees spread across floors 44 through 74 of the World Trade Center's South Tower. To most people, the Twin Towers represented America's economic might and architectural achievement. To Rick Rescorla, they represented the world's most obvious terrorist target. In 1990, 11 years before 9/11, Rescorla conducted his own security assessment of the World Trade Center. What he found horrified him. Working with his old Vietnam buddy Dan Hill, a security expert, Rescorla identified exactly how terrorists might attack the buildings. Their report was chillingly prescient. They warned that a truck bomb in the underground garage could bring down the towers, and they recommended that the Port Authority install concrete barriers and implement stringent vehicle screening. The Port Authority largely ignored their recommendations. When the 1993 World Trade Center bombing proved their fears justified, killing 6 people and injuring over 1,000, Rescorla didn't feel vindicated. He felt terrified. The attack had failed to topple the buildings only because the terrorists had positioned their truck bomb incorrectly. "They'll be back," he told anyone who would listen, "and next time, they'll come from the sky." Here's where the story takes a turn that will make your blood run cold. Rescorla didn't just predict that terrorists would return to finish the job. He correctly predicted they would use hijacked aircraft as weapons, and he spent the next 8 years preparing for that exact scenario. While government agencies and corporate executives clung to the illusion of safety, Rescorla turned Morgan Stanley's offices into a fortress of preparedness. He instituted mandatory evacuation drills every 3 months, forcing employees to walk down dozens of flights of stairs while he barked orders through a bullhorn and sang songs to keep their spirits up. His colleagues thought he was crazy. Wall Street executives don't appreciate having their million-dollar meetings interrupted by evacuation drills. Employees grumbled about the inconvenience. Some complained to management about the paranoid security chief who made them practice walking downstairs. Rescorla didn't care. Every drill was a rehearsal for the day he knew was coming. He studied the building's vulnerabilities obsessively, memorizing every stairwell, every exit, every potential bottleneck. He calculated evacuation times down to the minute and identified the safest routes down. He even kept a cache of emergency supplies in his office, including a bullhorn that would soon save thousands of lives. His preparations went beyond mere drills. Rescorla advocated repeatedly for Morgan Stanley to move out of the World Trade Center entirely, arguing that the buildings were sitting ducks for another attack. When the company balked at the expense, he focused on what he could control, making sure his people would know exactly what to do when the inevitable happened. The man who had once sung Cornish songs under enemy fire in Vietnam now sang them in corporate stairwells, teaching his employees to stay calm during evacuations. His voice, that same powerful instrument that had inspired soldiers in a jungle war, now echoed through the canyons of Lower Manhattan, preparing civilians for a battle they didn't know was coming. At 8:46 a.m. on September 11, 2001, American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower. Rick Rescorla was in his office on the 44th floor of the South Tower when the building shook from the impact next door. While others stared in shock at the television coverage or gathered at windows to see what was happening, Rescorla was already moving. He grabbed his bullhorn, his walkie-talkie, and his red bandana, his signature headwear that made him instantly recognizable to his employees. Then he began doing what he had trained for his entire career, saving lives. The Port Authority's public address system told people in the South Tower to return to their offices, that the building was secure. Rescorla ignored the announcement completely. He had studied these buildings for over a decade, had predicted this exact type of attack, and had trained his people for this moment. He trusted his instincts over official pronouncements. "This is it! Everyone out!" he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced death before. Using his bullhorn and his commanding presence, Rescorla began evacuating all 22 floors of Morgan Stanley's offices, nearly 3,000 people. As his employees streamed into the stairwells, Rescorla moved among them like a shepherd guiding his flock. He sang songs to keep their spirits up, cracked jokes to ease their fear, and used his military bearing to maintain order in what could have easily become a panic. Witnesses later recalled his calm demeanor and encouraging words as he directed traffic in the crowded stairwells. When United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower at 9:03 a.m., striking floors 77-85, just above Morgan Stanley's offices, Rescorla's evacuation was already well underway. The impact killed hundreds instantly and trapped countless others above the crash site. But Morgan Stanley's employees were flowing down the stairs in an orderly procession that Rescorla had orchestrated with military precision. By 9:45 a.m., most of Morgan Stanley's employees had evacuated the building. Rescorla could have left then, could have saved himself and been hailed as the hero who got his people out. Instead, he did what soldiers do. He went back for anyone who might be left behind. Witnesses saw him on multiple floors, checking offices, looking for stragglers, helping slower evacuees down the stairs. His red bandana became a beacon of hope in the smoke-filled stairwells. His voice, still strong and reassuring, continued to guide people to safety even as the building shuddered around them. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. Rick Rescorla was last seen on the 10th floor, still searching for survivors, still trying to save one more life. His body was never found. Here's the statistic that should make Rick Rescorla a household name. Of Morgan Stanley's 2,687 employees in the South Tower that day, only 6 died, including Rescorla himself and 4 colleagues who stayed behind to help with the evacuation. That's a survival rate of 99.8%. To put that in perspective, the overall survival rate for people above the crash zones in both towers was 0. Everyone on floors 77 and above in the South Tower died when Flight 175 hit, except for the Morgan Stanley employees who had already evacuated under Rescorla's orders. By ignoring official instructions to stay put and trusting his own instincts and training, Rick Rescorla saved more civilian lives on 9/11 than any other single individual. His pre-positioning and evacuation drills turned what should have been a massacre into the most successful emergency evacuation in American history. So why don't we know his name? Why isn't Rick Rescorla's story taught in every American history class, commemorated with monuments, or celebrated in Hollywood films? Perhaps it's because his greatest achievement was preventative. He made sure people weren't there when the worst happened. Dead heroes make better stories than living survivors. Perhaps it's because he was a corporate security officer rather than a uniformed first responder, and our mythology of heroism favors those who wear badges. Or perhaps it's because his story is almost too perfect, too prescient, too much like fiction to feel real. But Rick Rescorla's story is absolutely real, and it carries lessons that transcend the specific tragedy of 9/11. In an age of increasing uncertainty and emerging threats, Rescorla's example shows us the power of preparation, the importance of thinking independently, and the courage required to act on unpopular convictions. He reminds us that the greatest heroes are often those who see danger coming and do something about it, even when others dismiss their concerns as paranoia. He shows us that leadership isn't about having a title or wearing a uniform. It's about taking responsibility for others and being willing to sacrifice everything for their safety. Most importantly, Rick Rescorla's story proves that one person, properly prepared and completely committed, can make a difference that echoes through generations. In the chaos and horror of 9/11, when so much went wrong, his voice singing in the stairwells represents something that went spectacularly right. The next time you hear someone dismissed as paranoid for preparing for unlikely disasters, remember the British soldier who became an American hero by taking the unthinkable seriously. Remember the man whose final act was climbing back up a doomed tower to save one more life. Remember Rick Rescorla, the forgotten hero whose greatest victory was a tragedy that never happened to the people he swore to protect. Because sometimes the most important history is written not by those who witness great events, but by those who make sure others live to tell the story.